The summons came on a day when the very air of Montgomery Hall seemed to hold its breath. A single, sharp chime from the silver bell in Silas Montgomery's study cut through the thick afternoon stillness, a sound his 3 daughters had learned to dread. It was a sound that never promised good news, only the heavy weight of their father's expectations. Eleanor, the eldest, felt the chime like a physical blow, her spine straightening instinctively as she set aside her book. Charlotte, ever the portrait of duty, immediately smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from her skirt. Only Amelia looked up from her embroidery with a flicker of hopeful curiosity, her youthful mind incapable of conjuring the storm that was about to break. They assembled in the opulent parlor, a room designed to proclaim the Montgomery wealth to any who entered. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the grand windows, glinting off the gilded frames of ancestral portraits and catching the deep crimson of the velvet drapes. The room was a masterpiece of curated affluence, but to Eleanor, the polished mahogany and imported silk only masked a creeping decay, a subtle scent of mildew and desperation that no amount of beeswax could conceal. Silas Montgomery stood before the cold marble fireplace, a formidable figure silhouetted against the light. His face, usually a mask of stern composure, was etched with new lines of strain, his fingers worrying the heavy gold signet ring he always wore. He did not invite them to sit. His gaze swept over them, not as a father regarding his children, but as a general assessing his assets. He began without preamble, his voice a low, gravelly roll that demanded absolute attention. He spoke of legacy, of a name that had commanded respect in Virginia for generations. He painted a picture of their glorious past, of balls and hunts and a society that bowed to the Montgomery will. Then, his tone shifted, darkening as he revealed the truth he had so carefully hidden. Debts, he confessed, had mounted like a silent, insidious tide. Bad investments, the changing economy, a series of misfortunes. All had conspired to bring their house to the very brink of ruin. The magnificent plantation was a gilded shell, its foundations crumbling. And then came the decree, the scheme he had concocted to salvage their fortune and name. He had, in secret, secured the interest of 3 exceptionally wealthy suitors. Each daughter was to be matched, their beauty and breeding offered as the final currency to settle his accounts and secure new, powerful alliances. It was not a request or a discussion of futures. It was a transaction, plainly and coldly stated. Their lives were to be the final payment on his failures. The shock in the room was a palpable force. Eleanor felt a cold fury settle in her chest, her sharp mind immediately dissecting her father's words for the lies they surely concealed. Her eyes, the color of a winter storm, narrowed as she studied him, seeing not a desperate patriarch but a cornered man willing to sell his own flesh and blood. Charlotte, standing beside her, absorbed the news with a quiet, tragic dignity. Her shoulders slumped for only a moment before she forced them back, her sense of duty a cage she had been born inside. She saw the anguish in her father's eyes and misinterpreted it as noble suffering, a burden she felt compelled to share. Her fate, she believed, was inextricably tied to the family's honor, and if this was the price, she would pay it. Amelia, the youngest, reacted with a breathless, naive hope. The words fortune and ruin meant little to her, but suitors painted pictures of romance from the novels she devoured. A blush colored her cheeks as she imagined a handsome stranger, a whirlwind courtship, a life of love and admiration. She saw not a business arrangement, but the beginning of her own fairy tale, completely oblivious to the gilded trap being set around her. In the suffocating silence that followed their father's speech, the 3 sisters stood united by blood yet divided by their very natures, their destinies irrevocably set on a collision course with the grim truth of their father's design. The heavy oak door of Eleanor's bedchamber clicked shut, sealing the 3 sisters away from the oppressive grandeur of the parlor and into a sanctuary thick with unspoken fears. The lingering scent of lavender and old books did little to calm the tempest that had followed them upstairs. Eleanor moved first, her skirts whispering against the floorboards as she paced the length of the worn Persian rug, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. The composed mask she had worn for their father had shattered, revealing the raw suspicion burning beneath. She stopped before the window, staring out at the sprawling plantation lands that were both their home and their prison. The setting sun bled crimson across the fields, a dramatic, violent beauty that seemed to mock their predicament. Her reflection in the glass was a pale, sharp-edged ghost superimposed over the dying light. Charlotte settled gracefully on the edge of the four-poster bed, her posture still unnaturally perfect, as if the weight of their name was a physical burden she must bear with elegance. She watched Eleanor's restless movements with a pained expression, her fingers nervously tracing the intricate pattern of the counterpane. Amelia, meanwhile, drifted to the dressing table, picking up a silver-handled hairbrush as if it were a token from a future admirer. A dreamy, faraway look softened her features, the initial shock already giving way to a flutter of romantic anticipation. She saw herself in the mirror not as a pawn in a transaction, but as the heroine of an impending drama. It was Eleanor who broke the tense silence, her voice low and venomous. She gave voice to the dread coiling in her gut, articulating the cold calculation she had seen in their father's eyes. This was not about saving their legacy, she insisted. It was about salvaging his own skin. The suitors were not rescuers, but creditors of a different sort, and their marriages would be a final, desperate payment on a debt of dishonor. She painted a picture of their futures as gilded cages, their lives bartered to men whose wealth was likely as tainted as their father's motives. Charlotte's defense was immediate, a reflex born of a lifetime of obedience. She spoke of duty, of the honor bound to the Montgomery name, a fragile vessel that it was their responsibility to keep afloat. She saw their father's announcement not as a betrayal, but as a tragic necessity, the last, painful sacrifice required of them to prevent total disgrace. Her words were a plea for reason, for accepting a bitter fate with grace, for trusting in the patriarchal hand that had always, however sternly, guided them. But Amelia heard neither the suspicion nor the duty. She sighed, a soft, wistful sound, and spoke of possibility. She imagined a suitor's gallant bow, his whispered compliments, the thrill of a courtship that would be the envy of every other girl in the county. In her mind, their father's scheme was merely the opening chapter of her own love story, a necessary formality to introduce her to her destiny. She saw ballrooms and romance where Eleanor saw ledgers and deceit. The divide between them widened with each exchanged glance, a chasm of perspective that love alone could not bridge. Eleanor looked at her sisters, one blinded by duty, the other by fantasy, and a fierce, protective resolve hardened within her. The truth was a shadow lurking just beyond the edges of their father's story, a secret he was determined to keep buried. As twilight deepened in the room, swallowing the last of the crimson light, Eleanor made a silent vow, a promise that sealed her own fate as surely as any marriage contract. She would uncover that truth, no matter the cost, and she would do it before their father could sell their lives to settle his accounts. The whispers in the parlor had ended, but the investigation had just begun. The arrival of Mr. Alastair Harrington was heralded not by any formal announcement, but by the particular tension that settled over Montgomery Hall in the hours preceding dinner. The air grew thick with unspoken instructions, and the household staff moved with a brittle efficiency that spoke of fear rather than routine. Silas Montgomery had been a ghost in his own study all afternoon, but as the clock neared 7, he emerged transformed. His usual sternness polished into a sharp, almost predatory affability. He gathered his daughters in the formal drawing room, his eyes lingering on Eleanor with a calculating weight that made her skin prickle. When Harrington entered, he did not so much arrive as occupy the space. He was a man of imposing stature, his broad shoulders straining the fabric of his impeccably tailored coat. His face was a study in hard angles and cold assessment, his eyes the color of flint scanning the room as if tallying its value. He carried with him an aura of acquired wealth, the kind that wore its newness like armor, polished to a high, intimidating shine. His handshake with Silas was a brief, forceful clash of wills, but it was the way his gaze swept over the sisters that chilled Eleanor to the bone. It was not a look of appraisal but of acquisition. Dinner was a meticulously orchestrated theater of discomfort. The long mahogany table, set with the family's best silver and china, felt like a stage for a grim performance. Silas presided with forced joviality, steering the conversation toward topics designed to showcase Harrington's success. Shipping lanes, commodity prices, the ruthless efficiency of his various enterprises. Harrington held forth not with charm, but with a blunt, unshakable arrogance. He spoke of competitors ruined with a casual flick of his wrist, of laborers dismissed as easily as one might discard a used napkin. He recounted a story of a business rival's financial collapse with a cold smile, his pleasure derived not from his own success, but from another's utter destruction. Eleanor watched him throughout the meal, her food untouched. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the portraits of her ancestors, not with reverence, but with the avarice of a man calculating how soon they might be his to sell. She observed the cruel set of his mouth when he addressed a young footman who momentarily fumbled with a wine decanter, the silent promise of retribution in his stare making the boy's hands tremble for the rest of the evening. This was not a potential husband. This was a conqueror surveying his next territory. Later, as the men lingered over port and the sisters were meant to retire, Eleanor found her moment. She feigned a headache and slipped away from the drawing room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not go upstairs, but instead made her way to the servants' quarters, the hushed, utilitarian underbelly of the house. She found Bess, a young housemaid with kind, wary eyes, folding linens in a quiet corner of the laundry. Eleanor's approach was gentle, her voice a low whisper in the soap-scented air. She asked not about the dinner, but about the rumors that followed a man of Mr. Harrington's standing. At first, Bess was hesitant, her eyes darting toward the door, but Eleanor's sincere concern and the shared understanding of their powerlessness loosened her tongue. The words came out in a rushed, fearful torrent. She spoke of Harrington's reputation in the city, of factories with deplorable conditions, of debts collected with brutal force, of whispers linking him to men who operated in the city's darkest corners. There were stories, Bess confided, her voice barely audible, of a first wife who had died under mysterious and sudden circumstances, her fortune seamlessly absorbed into his own. The confirmation of her every suspicion was a cold stone in Eleanor's stomach. The arrogant performance at dinner was not a facade. It was the man's true nature, polished and put on display as a virtue. Her father was not merely selling her to a wealthy man. He was chaining her to a monster to settle his debts. As she slipped back into the main hall, the sound of Harrington's booming laugh echoing from the drawing room felt like a portent of a future she would move heaven and earth to avoid. The first suitor had been presented, and he was everything she had feared, and worse. The oppressive atmosphere of Montgomery Hall became a cage Eleanor could no longer endure. The memory of Mr. Harrington's cold gaze and her father's calculating silence clung to the velvet drapes and polished floors, a pervasive miasma of deceit. 2 days after the disastrous dinner, Eleanor seized her chance during the afternoon lull, when the household retreated into the drowsy stillness of a Virginia heatwave. Claiming a need for fresh air and a turn in the gardens to settle her nerves, she wrapped a simple shawl around her shoulders, its plain weave a silent rebellion against the finery expected of her. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drum counting out the seconds of her deception as she slipped through a side door, the humid air closing around her like a conspirator's cloak. Her destination was not the manicured rose gardens, but the old oak grove that marked the far boundary of the Montgomery property, a place where the ordered world of the plantation gave way to untamed woodland. The path was overgrown, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight pierced the dense canopy in scattered, golden shafts, illuminating swirling motes of pollen and dust. There, waiting on a moss-covered fallen log, was the hunched figure of Mrs. Higgins. The town gossip was a bird-like woman with sharp, darting eyes that missed nothing, her gnarled fingers clutching a worn basket. She was the keeper of every secret in the county, a living ledger of scandals and sorrows, and Eleanor knew she was her only hope for the unvarnished truth. Eleanor approached, the crunch of her boots on the leafy ground sounding unnaturally loud. Mrs. Higgins looked up, her gaze sharp and knowing. No pleasantries were exchanged. They were two women engaged in a transaction far more honest than the one Silas Montgomery had proposed. Eleanor pressed a small, heavy coin into the woman's waiting palm, the metal a cold promise of payment for dangerous knowledge. Mrs. Higgins's voice was a dry rustle, barely louder than the whisper of the leaves. She confirmed the scale of Silas's ruin, painting a picture of debt so massive it seemed to suck the very light from the forest. It was not merely a matter of failed crops or poor investments, she hissed, leaning closer. The debts were owed to men who operated in shadowy corners of finance and politics, men whose favors came with strings that could strangle a legacy. The marriages, she revealed, were not just about the dowries the suitors would provide. They were a smokescreen, a respectable facade for something far darker. The alliances with men like Harrington and the others were meant to launder more than just money. They were meant to cleanse reputations, to weave the Montgomery name into a web of powerful, illicit interests that stretched from the Virginia docks to the halls of government. A chill that had nothing to do with the shaded grove seeped into Eleanor's bones. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and confusing, began to click into a horrifying picture. Her father was not just salvaging his fortune. He was selling his daughter's futures to secure his place in a criminal enterprise. Mrs. Higgins's eyes then narrowed, her voice dropping to a threadbare whisper as she delivered her final, grim warning. She told Eleanor that the men her father was entangled with were not the kind to tolerate a curious daughter prying into their affairs. Silas was a desperate man, and desperate men were capable of anything. If she valued her safety, and the safety of her sisters, she would let the matter lie. To probe further was to stick her hand into a nest of vipers. The meeting ended as abruptly as it began, Mrs. Higgins melting back into the shadows of the woods, leaving Eleanor alone with the crushing weight of the truth and a warning that echoed like a funeral knell in the silent, sun-dappled grove. The poison of the secret meeting lingered in Eleanor's veins, a corrosive truth that made every polished surface of Montgomery Hall feel like a lie. She moved through the next day as if in a trance, the words of Mrs. Higgins echoing in her mind, a grim counterpoint to the mundane sounds of the household. She watched her sisters with a new, aching desperation. Charlotte arranging flowers with serene precision, Amelia humming a cheerful tune as she sketched by the window. They were lambs being led to a slaughter they could not even perceive, and the weight of her knowledge was a solitary burden she could not yet share. The confrontation erupted not in the shadows, but in the full, unforgiving light of the afternoon parlor. Silas summoned them once more, his demeanor transformed from the strained patriarch into a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous negotiation. He stood before them, a ledger of debts momentarily forgotten on his desk, and announced with palpable relief that a solution had been found. Mr. Harrington, impressed by their family's dignity and Charlotte's evident grace, had agreed to a most advantageous match. He would take Charlotte as his bride. The heir left the room. Eleanor felt the world tilt, her worst fears crystallizing in the smug satisfaction on her father's face. But before she could form a single word of protest, Charlotte stepped forward. Her head was bowed not in shame, but in submission. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet yet clear, each word a shard of ice piercing Eleanor's heart. She accepted. She spoke of duty, of the honor of securing the family's future, of her role as a daughter to obey and to save them all. She believed she was making the ultimate sacrifice, a noble martyr on the altar of their name. A bitter, furious argument exploded between the sisters, shattering the parlor's fragile peace. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure shattered. She grabbed Charlotte's arm, her voice a raw, desperate whisper that scraped the edges of the room. She pleaded with her, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of the life that awaited her. A life as the property of a cruel man, a prison of gilded misery, a union founded on their father's criminal desperation. She spoke of Harrington's reputation, of the whispers about his first wife, of the cold avarice in his eyes. But Charlotte, fortified by a lifetime of indoctrinated obedience, would not be swayed. She saw Eleanor's passion not as a protective warning, but as a selfish rebellion. She accused Eleanor of thinking only of herself, of being unwilling to make the hard choices necessary for their family's survival. She pulled her arm away as if Eleanor's touch had burned her, her own eyes flashing with a hurt and righteous anger. The chasm between them, once a fissure of differing opinions, now yawned wide and unbridgeable, a gorge carved by betrayal and misunderstood love. It was then that Silas intervened, his voice dripping with paternal approval. He placed a heavy hand on Charlotte's shoulder, his gaze sweeping over Eleanor with cold disdain. He praised Charlotte's obedience, her understanding of what it meant to be a Montgomery. He called her his true daughter, the one who understood sacrifice and honor. Each word was a deliberate blow, deepening the rift, rewarding the compliance that served his scheme and punishing the defiance that threatened it. He had not only secured a business arrangement, he had successfully divided his daughters, turning their love for one another into a weapon for his own preservation. As he led a weeping, yet resolute Charlotte from the room, Eleanor was left standing alone in the opulent silence, the taste of ashes in her mouth, the bonds of sisterhood frayed to a single trembling thread. The silence of Montgomery Hall that night was a different creature altogether, no longer oppressive but conspiratorial. The house seemed to hold its breath, its creaks and sighs the only sounds in the deep post-midnight hour. Eleanor moved through the shadows like a wraith, a single candle casting a trembling pool of light that did little to push back the darkness. The bitter taste of Charlotte's betrayal still coated her tongue, a metallic tang of despair that had only hardened her resolve. Her father's study, his inner sanctum, was the heart of the mystery, and she was determined to cut it open. The heavy oak door yielded with a soft, reluctant click. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old leather, cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet odor of decaying paper. Moonlight streamed through the tall window, illuminating the massive desk, a fortress of mahogany and secrets. This was where Silas Montgomery crafted his deceptions, where he had coolly bartered away his daughter's futures. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and defiance. She set the candle down, its flame guttering in a sudden draft. Her search was methodical, her fingers tracing the edges of drawers, probing behind books on the high shelves. She rejected the obvious. The unlocked drawers contained only mundane estate reports and hunting logs. The truth, she knew, would be hidden, a shameful thing kept from the light. Her gaze fell upon the great stone fireplace, its mantelpiece a carved testament to Montgomery pride. One of the stones near the base, darker and smoother than its neighbors, seemed almost to beckon her. She pressed against it, her nails finding a nearly invisible seam. With a gritty, grinding sound that was deafening in the silence, the stone pivoted inward, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in the dust and shadow, lay a single leather-bound ledger. It was not the official plantation accounts, but something far more personal, its cover worn soft with anxious handling. Eleanor lifted it out, the weight of it feeling like a physical manifestation of her father's sins. She carried it to the desk, the moonlight her accomplice as she opened the cover. The pages were a spider's web of figures and names, a confession written in columns of profit and loss. The numbers were staggering, a waterfall of red ink that detailed debts so vast they seemed to suck the air from the room. But it was the notes, scrawled in her father's tight, agitated hand in the margins, that laid the scheme bare. Next to a massive debt to a J. Croft were the words, Harrington Union Settlement in full. Another, owed to a R.S. Company, was marked Beaumont Alliance. Shipping interest secured. The marriages were not just about the dowries. They were direct payments, line items in a ledger of moral bankruptcy. Her eyes widened as she deciphered the coded language of corruption. Shipping interests were not mere cargo. They were references to the human cargo of the slave trade, a vile commerce her father was now leveraging for his survival. The political favors, secured through these alliances, were votes and protections for the very men who profited from this misery. The ledger laid out the entire sordid architecture of the plan. Her father was using his daughters as the final, respectable gateway to entrench himself within a network of the most powerful and corrupt men in the state. Their lives, their names, their very bodies were the currency he was using to pay off his creditors and buy his way into a criminal consortium. A cold, clear fury washed over her, burning away the last vestiges of doubt and fear. This was no longer about saving Charlotte from a bad marriage or protecting Amelia's naive heart. This was about confronting a rot so profound it threatened to consume them all. She closed the ledger, its damning evidence seared into her memory. As she carefully returned it to its hiding place and smoothed the stone back into the wall, Eleanor was no longer just a suspicious daughter. She was a witness, armed with the cold, hard truth, and the battle for their futures had truly begun. The arrival of Mr. Julian Beaumont was a soft counterpoint to the harsh clang of Mr. Harrington's presence. He did not occupy space with brute force, but rather seemed to glide into it, his charm a silken net cast over the grim realities of Montgomery Hall. Where Harrington was winter's bite, Beaumont was a deceptive spring thaw, all gentle smiles and mellifluous tones that promised warmth but hid the shifting, unstable ground beneath. From the moment he was introduced in the sunlit parlor, he fixed his attention on Amelia, the youngest and most vulnerable of the three sisters, with the precision of a master angler selecting his lure. He was a man of elegant, almost delicate features, with warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled and a voice that wrapped around his words like velvet. He spoke not of commerce or conquest, but of art and music, of poetry and the latest novels from Europe, his knowledge perfectly tailored to Amelia's romantic sensibilities. He listened to her simple, hopeful observations with an appearance of rapt fascination, making her feel like the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. He brought gifts, not the ostentatious, heavy jewels a man like Harrington might offer, but tokens of thoughtful affection. A first edition of a volume of sonnets, its leather cover soft and fragrant. A delicate watercolor of a bluebird, its colors vibrant and alive. A lace fan from Paris, so fine it seemed woven from moonlight and cobwebs. Each present was a key, carefully crafted to unlock another chamber of Amelia's trusting heart. Amelia, still reeling from the tension between Eleanor and Charlotte and the grim reality of Charlotte's engagement, blossomed under this calculated attention. The dark undercurrents of the household, the whispered arguments and her father's strained silences, all receded behind the golden glow of Mr. Beaumont's courtship. She saw only the gallant suitor from her storybooks, the one who valued her mind and soul, who saw past her family's name to the unique woman within. She began to dress with more care, her laughter returning to the halls, a sound so light and airy it seemed to mock the heavy secrets festering in the study and in Eleanor's heart. She was floating on a cloud of flattery and fantasy, completely unaware that the hands holding her aloft were stained with a trade far more vile than her father's debts. It was in the quiet solitude of the upstairs sitting room, with the evening shadows stretching long across the floor, that she sought out Eleanor. She found her eldest sister staring out the window, her profile a sharp, worried line against the deepening twilight. Amelia, her face radiant with uncontained joy, settled on the settee beside her, clutching a new, leather-bound journal Beaumont had given her that very afternoon. She poured out her feelings in a breathless, guileless torrent, her words painting a future of idyllic happiness. She spoke of his kindness, his intelligence, his apparent depth of feeling. She confessed her growing affection, her belief that this was not an arrangement of convenience but a true meeting of souls, a love that could transcend their father's grim financial machinations. Eleanor listened, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She watched the hopeful light in Amelia's eyes, the trusting curve of her smile, and felt a protective agony so sharp it was physical. She saw the perfect, horrifying brilliance of her father's scheme. He had not paired Amelia with a brute. He had paired her with a serpent, a man whose gentle manners were a perfect disguise for the monster he truly was. Amelia's innocence was not a shield. It was the very quality that made her the perfect, unwitting victim. As Amelia sighed, dreaming aloud of a life filled with poetry and love, Eleanor could only hold her tongue, the damning evidence from the ledger and Mrs. Higgins's warnings forming a barrier of terrible knowledge between them. To speak now would be to shatter her sister's world, but to stay silent was to let her walk, smiling and blind, into a gilded cage whose lock was forged in human suffering. A secret, once loosed into the world, took on a life of its own, slithering from whispered conversations in drawing rooms to hissed speculations at the market square. The carefully constructed facade of Montgomery honor began to crack under the relentless pressure of public scrutiny, and the fissure originated from the lips of Mrs. Higgins. Fueled by the coin Eleanor had provided and her own insatiable appetite for being the purveyor of the most salacious news, the old woman became a one-woman rumor mill, her hunched figure a familiar sight on porches and in shop doorways, her voice a dry rustle that sowed seeds of scandal. The news traveled not in a roar, but in a susurrus, a low hum that infected the humid Virginia air. It began in the general store, where women selecting bolts of calico would lean their heads together, their eyes darting toward the door as they murmured about Silas Montgomery's shocking desperation. How far the mighty have fallen, they would cluck, their sympathy thin and laced with a prurient curiosity. They dissected the suitors, the brutish Harrington with his dubious fortune, the charming but mysterious Beaumont, and speculated on what truly lay behind their sudden interest in the Montgomery daughters. It was not love, they agreed, but something far more transactional, and the nature of that transaction was the most delicious part of the gossip. At the blacksmith's forge and outside the courthouse, the men spoke in gruffer, more cynical tones. They talked of ledgers and liabilities, of plantations mortgaged to the hilt and creditors circling like vultures. They saw the marriages not as a romantic tragedy, but as a business failure of epic proportions. Silas Montgomery, once a pillar of the community, was now a cautionary tale, a man so bankrupt in both finance and honor that he had to sell his own flesh and blood to appease his debtors. The name Montgomery, once spoken with respect, was now uttered with a shake of the head and a knowing, grim smile. The fate of the daughters became a source of morbid fascination and pity. Eleanor was cast as the tragic, sharp-witted spinster, too clever for her own good and doomed to see her family crumble around her. Charlotte was the dutiful lamb being led to a financial slaughter, her obedience her greatest flaw. But it was Amelia who captured the most poignant share of the town's sympathy. The story of the naive, romantic youngest daughter, being wooed by a serpent in gentleman's clothing, was a narrative straight from a Gothic novel. People whispered that she was the true victim, her heart being won under false pretenses, her future the greatest casualty of her father's sin. These rumors, carried on the wind and nurtured in every corner of the town, did not remain outside the gates of Montgomery Hall. They seeped under the doors and through the closed windows, a pervasive tension that everyone felt and no one acknowledged. Servants exchanged knowing glances, their loyalty strained by the shame now attached to the name they served. Silas became more reclusive, his temper shorter, the public humiliation a lash on his already raw pride. For Eleanor, the gossip was a double-edged sword. It was the very exposure she had sought, yet it also raised the stakes impossibly high, turning their private struggle into a public spectacle and ensuring that the coming confrontation would have an audience waiting with bated breath. The town was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a character in their drama, its judgmental gaze raising the tension to a nearly unbearable pitch. The hum of the town's gossip had become a tangible force, a current of judgment and speculation that seemed to electrify the very dust motes dancing in the sunlit air of Montgomery Hall. For Eleanor, the whispers were no longer just background noise. They were a countdown, a public clock ticking toward the moment her sisters' lives would be irrevocably broken on the wheel of their father's ambition. The ledger's cold figures and Mrs. Higgins's ominous warnings had painted a horrifying picture, but it was a picture rendered in shadow and implication. To save Amelia from the charming predator circling her, Eleanor needed proof, something solid and undeniable that could shatter the gilded illusion of Julian Beaumont. Her opportunity came on a day when the oppressive heat broke under the threat of a distant storm. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, their bellies heavy with promised rain, and a restless wind whispered through the magnolia trees, carrying the scent of ozone and damp earth. Beaumont, after a morning spent charming Amelia with more poetry and promises, took his leave from the plantation, citing urgent business in town. But there was a furtive energy in his departure, a glance over his shoulder that was too quick, too assessing. Eleanor, watching from her window, felt the familiar prickle of suspicion sharpen into a clear, cold certainty. This was not a trip to a counting house or a gentleman's club. This was something else. Disguising herself in a drab, hooded cloak usually worn by the scullery maid, she slipped from the house, her movements fluid and silent. She kept to the overgrown lanes and hedgerows, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The wind tugged at her cloak, a willing accomplice in her deception. Beaumont, on his fine chestnut mare, took the main road toward the city, but then, just before reaching the bustling center, he turned down a narrow, filth-choked alley that led toward the river. The air changed instantly. The genteel scents of baking bread and blooming gardens were replaced by the pungent odors of tar, rotting fish, and the faint, sickly sweet smell of bilge water. They were heading for the docks. Eleanor followed at a dangerous distance, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the damp cobblestones. The world narrowed into a canyon of leaning, weather-beaten warehouses, their walls scarred with salt and grime. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the mournful cry of gulls and the low, rhythmic lap of water against wooden pylons. Beaumont dismounted before a particularly dilapidated structure, its windows boarded up, a single heavy door its only feature. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. A signal. The door creaked open, and he vanished inside. Creeping closer, Eleanor found a gap between two warped planks in the warehouse wall, a slit just wide enough to offer a sliver of a view. The interior was cavernous and dim, lit only by a few lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap tobacco, and something else, something metallic and faintly coppery that made her stomach clench. 3 men stood in the circle of lantern light with Beaumont. They were coarse, hard-faced men with the sun-leathered skin and powerful builds of those who made their living from violence and the sea. Slaver crews. The words from the ledger. Asterisk shipping interests secured asterisk. Screamed in her mind. She watched, her breath frozen in her lungs, as Beaumont, his genteel demeanor entirely shed, gestured with sharp, impatient motions. One of the slavers, a giant of a man with a scar bisecting his lip, unrolled a heavy canvas map on a crate. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their words indistinct, but their meaning was horrifyingly clear. They were discussing routes, timetables, human cargo. Beaumont pointed to a location on the map, then to a ledger of his own, its pages filled with the same kind of grim accounting she had found in her father's study. This was the reality behind the sonnets and the lace fans. This was the source of the money that was to purchase her sister's life. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the small pouch at her waist, pulling out a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper. She had to get names, details, anything she could use. She pressed the paper against the rough wood of the wall, her hand shaking as she tried to scribble what she could see. The name of a ship, the Sea Nymph, scrawled on a crate. A partial name, J. Croft, from the ledger page. It was flimsy, desperate evidence, but it was a start. A sudden, violent crack of thunder boomed directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the warehouse. Startled, Eleanor jerked back, her shoulder knocking against a loose stack of empty barrels. The sound was deafening in the tense silence, a clumsy, clattering announcement of her presence. Inside, the conversation stopped dead. All 4 men turned their heads in unison toward the source of the noise, their faces hardening into masks of alarm and fury. Beaumont's eyes, usually so warm and smiling, were chips of cold flint, scanning the darkness where she hid. There was no time to think, only to run. Eleanor gathered her cloak and fled, her feet slipping on the wet stones as she plunged back into the maze of alleys. Behind her, she heard the warehouse door slam open and the shouted curses of the men. The wind howled now, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, stinging her face as she ran, the damning scrap of paper clutched in her fist, the proof of Beaumont's true nature seared into her memory alongside the terrifying certainty that she had been seen. The rain fell in earnest now, a cold, driving deluge that soaked through Eleanor's cloak and plastered her hair to her scalp. She did not feel it. The only cold she registered was the one lodged deep in her bones, a glacial fear forged in the sight of Julian Beaumont's true face, the calculating slaver, not the charming suitor. The image of him standing in that grimy warehouse, his hands tracing routes of human misery on a map, was seared behind her eyes, more vivid and terrifying than any phantom from a nightmare. The scrap of paper in her hand, with its smudged, rain-blurred clues, felt pathetically inadequate, but the memory of what she had witnessed was a weapon. She could not go to Amelia with this. The shock would be too great, the denial too certain. There was only one person who could call off this monstrous charade, only one person who held the strings. She had to confront her father. She entered Montgomery Hall not through the grand front entrance, but through a side door used by the groundskeeper, her sodden clothes and disheveled appearance drawing a gasp from a passing maid. Eleanor paid her no mind. A fierce, burning clarity had replaced her fear. Water dripped from her cloak onto the polished floor of the main hall, leaving a trail of dark spots like a path of tears leading directly to her father's study. She did not pause to knock. She turned the brass handle and pushed the door open, the weight of her discovery giving her a strength she had never before possessed. Silas Montgomery was seated behind his fortress of a desk, a glass of amber liquid halfway to his lips. He looked up, his expression first one of annoyance at the interruption, then of stunned confusion at the sight of his eldest daughter standing before him like a vengeful water spirit, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen in them before. Eleanor did not wait for him to speak. She strode to the desk and slammed the wet, crumpled scrap of paper onto its polished surface. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, stripped of all deference, each word a carefully aimed dart. She did not accuse. She stated. She laid out the entire sordid tapestry she had pieced together, the ledger's coded entries, Mrs. Higgins's warnings, and finally, the damning scene she had just witnessed at the docks. She described the warehouse, the slavers, the map, and Beaumont's cold efficiency as he bartered in human lives. She connected the names, the debts, the alliances, weaving them into a narrative of corruption so profound it left the air in the study feeling thin and poisoned. For a long moment, Silas was silent, his face a pale, rigid mask. Then, a strange, weary resignation settled over his features. He did not rage or deny the specifics. He set his glass down with a soft click and admitted it. He admitted the debts, the sheer, staggering scale of them. He confessed that the marriages were, indeed, the only way to prevent the complete and utter dissolution of everything they owned, everything they were. He spoke of desperation, of having his back against a wall, of making choices no father should ever have to make. But when Eleanor pressed further, when she demanded to know how he could sleep at night, knowing he was selling his daughters to men whose fortunes were built on a foundation of human suffering, his demeanor shifted. The resignation hardened into a defensive, flinty anger. He flatly denied any deeper knowledge of the suitor's businesses. He claimed ignorance of the specifics of Beaumont's shipping interests, feigning shock and dismissing her eyewitness account as the hysterical imaginings of an overwrought girl who had been somewhere she had no business being. He was a businessman securing alliances, he insisted, not a moral arbiter of how his future sons-in-law conducted their affairs. Then came the threat. His eyes, so like her own, turned cold and distant. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If she continued down this path, if she spoke a word of these wild accusations to anyone, especially to her sisters, she would be cut off, disowned, stripped of the Montgomery name and cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back. She would be dead to him, and to the family she was so determined to destroy with her meddling. The love of a father was a conditional thing, his expression said, and her compliance was the price. The words should have shattered her. Instead, they crystallized her resolve. The last, fragile thread of hope that her father was merely a misguided man, a victim of circumstance, snapped. He was a willing participant, a man who would threaten his own child to protect his place in a web of evil. The cold fury that had been simmering within her now solidified into an unbreakable core of purpose. She looked at him, this stranger behind the desk, and saw not her father, but the enemy. Without another word, Eleanor turned her back on him. She walked out of the study, leaving the damning scrap of paper on his desk and the ghost of her former obedience in the space between them. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The confrontation was over. He had admitted his guilt and issued his ultimatum. And as she stood in the hall, dripping onto the floor, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that her investigation was far from over. It had only just begun. The ink-black truth her father had threatened her with was no longer a secret to be feared, but a weapon to be wielded. Eleanor moved through the next day in a state of heightened awareness, every creak of the floorboards and whisper from the servants feeling like a potential threat. Silas's ultimatum hung in the air, a poisonous mist, but it only served to clarify her path. She was utterly alone within the walls of Montgomery Hall, a traitor in her own home. To fight a network of powerful, corrupt men, she needed an ally from the world outside, someone who operated in the same shadows they did, but for a different purpose. The name came to her like a spark in the darkness. Samuel, the abolitionist journalist. Mrs. Higgins had once mentioned him in a hushed, fearful tone. A man who published under a pseudonym, a ghost who documented the sins of the slave trade and hid somewhere in the underbelly of the town, a constant thorn in the side of men like Beaumont. Finding him required a different kind of courage, one that ventured into a world far removed from plantation parlors and rose gardens. That evening, under the cover of a moonless sky, she slipped out once more. This time, her destination was not the genteel part of town, but the warren of cramped lanes and leaning tenements near the old shipyards, a place where respectability was a forgotten currency. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, boiled cabbage, and unwashed humanity. Lantern lights spilled from grimy tavern windows, illuminating the hard, wary faces of those who had nothing left to lose. Following the vague, fearful directions she had coaxed from a laundress with the last of her pin money, Eleanor found herself before a nondescript door at the end of a foul-smelling alley. A single, chipped number was nailed to the rotting wood. Her knock was a quiet, hesitant tap. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a floorboard creaked inside, and a narrow slit in the door, no wider than a finger, slid open. A pair of intense, intelligent eyes, set in a gaunt, bearded face, assessed her from the darkness. She did not give her name. She simply said she had information on Julian Beaumont and the ship the Sea Nymph. The name acted as a key. The bolt slid back with a rusty screech, and the door opened just enough for her to slip inside. The room was a stark contrast to the opulence she had left behind. It was a single Spartan space, lit by a single guttering candle on a rough-hewn table. The walls were lined with precarious stacks of books and pamphlets, and the air smelled of cheap tallow and ink. Samuel was a man worn thin by his cause, his clothes shabby but clean, his movements economical and precise. He did not offer her a seat, his gaze remaining guarded, suspicious of this well-spoken woman from a world he fought against. Eleanor did not waste time with pleasantries. She laid out her evidence with the cool precision of a prosecutor. She spoke of her father's ledger, the coded entries linking the marriages to the payment of debts owed to men like J. Croft. She described the clandestine meeting at the docks, the slavers, the map, and Beaumont's central role. She handed him the damp, crumpled scrap of paper with the ship's name. She watched as his initial skepticism melted away, replaced by a focused, grim intensity. He recognized the names, the patterns. Her story fit into a larger, darker picture he had been trying to expose for years. He listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, the only sound was the sputtering of the candle flame. Then he moved to a hidden compartment in the floorboards and retrieved his own sheaf of documents. Smuggled manifests, coded letters, lists of names. He laid them beside her meager evidence, and the two disparate collections fused into a damning whole. He showed her how her father's financial desperation was the perfect entry point for the slaving consortium to gain a foothold of respectability, to launder their money and influence through a venerable Virginia name. An unspoken agreement solidified in the cramped, ink-stained room. They were an unlikely alliance, the plantation heiress and the radical journalist, but they were united by a common enemy and a shared, burning need for justice. They began to plan, their voices low and urgent. Samuel would use his contacts to corroborate the evidence, to find the proof that would link the financial transactions directly to the slave ships. Eleanor would be his eyes and ears inside Montgomery Hall, monitoring the wedding preparations and the movements of Beaumont and Harrington, searching for any additional documents her father might have hidden. It was a dangerous, fragile pact, a slender thread of hope spun in a room that smelled of poverty and rebellion. But as Eleanor slipped back out into the hostile night, she no longer felt alone. She had an ally, and together, they would tear her father's gilded house down. The grim machinery of the wedding began to turn with a relentless, grinding efficiency, its gears oiled by Silas Montgomery's desperate haste and Charlotte's quiet, broken resolve. Montgomery Hall, once a symbol of genteel Southern grace, was transformed into a stage for a grotesque performance. The air, thick with the cloying scent of forced jollity and fresh-cut hothouse flowers, could not mask the underlying stench of fear and compromise. Workmen arrived daily, their heavy boots tracking mud across the polished floors as they erected garlands and draped swathes of ivory silk, transforming the grand parlor into a chapel of convenience. Every blossom placed, every ribbon tied, was a stitch in the shroud of Charlotte's former life, a visual celebration of the trap she had willingly entered. Charlotte moved through the chaos like a beautiful, haunted ghost. She stood for endless fittings, her body as still and pliable as a doll's, while the seamstress fussed over the extravagant gown of Brussels lace and pearl-encrusted satin, a garment that felt as heavy as chainmail on her shoulders. Her eyes, once so full of gentle conviction, were now hollow pools of resignation. She would watch her own reflection in the cheval glass, a stranger being prepared for a sacrifice, and a tremor would pass through her, so slight it was almost imperceptible. In the rare moments of solitude, her fingers would trace the cold, sharp lines of the betrothal ring Harrington had given her. A massive, flawless diamond in a brutal, unadorned setting. It was not a token of affection, but a brand, a symbol of ownership. She felt the walls of her future closing in, a gilded corridor leading to a life of silent misery. Yet the cage door, she believed, had already been locked from the inside by her own hand. The weight of her duty had become a tomb, and she was its sole living occupant. Amelia, in stark contrast, floated through the preparations on a cloud of delirious fantasy. She saw the wedding not as Charlotte's funeral, but as a thrilling prelude to her own. She cooed over the lace, sighed over the floral arrangements, and offered cheerful, utterly misplaced advice, her mind already leaping ahead to the day Mr. Beaumont would inevitably propose. His continued courtship was a balm to her spirit, a series of whispered endearments and lingering glances that convinced her their love was a singular, radiant thing, immune to the sordid financial realities that ensnared the rest of the family. She saw herself and Beaumont as the romantic heroes of this drama, their pure affection destined to triumph over all. Eleanor watched this tragic dichotomy unfold with a heart aching with a mixture of fury and profound sorrow. She tried, in moments snatched away from the prying eyes of their father and the servants, to pierce Amelia's blissful ignorance. She spoke in low, urgent tones of the danger that clung to Beaumont like a second skin, of the cold calculation behind his charming facade. She used vague but pointed words, hinting at the corruption that funded his gifts and his travels. But her warnings shattered against the fortress of Amelia's devotion. Amelia would shake her head, a faint, pitying smile on her lips, dismissing Eleanor's concerns as the bitter cynicism of a sister who knew no romance. She was certain that Eleanor, in her relentless pursuit of dark truths, simply could not recognize a real, honorable love when she saw it. Each rejected warning drove the wedge between them deeper, leaving Eleanor standing on one side of a chasm with the cold, hard facts, and Amelia on the other, surrounded by the beautiful, fragile architecture of her own delusion. The wedding plans advanced, a clock ticking down not to a celebration, but to a catastrophe, with one sister trapped by duty and the other blinded by a love that was the most cunning prison of all. The cramped, ink-stained room above the shipyards became their sanctuary and their war room, a world away from the suffocating opulence of Montgomery Hall. Here, surrounded by Samuel's precarious towers of pamphlets and smuggled documents. The air itself seemed to hum with the gravity of their purpose. The frantic energy of their initial alliance had settled into a grim, methodical rhythm. Eleanor's scraps of information, the names from the ledger, the description of the warehouse, the ship's name, were no longer isolated clues, but keys Samuel used to unlock a labyrinth of hidden records and coded correspondence. He moved through the underworld of informants and dockworkers with a ghost's silence, his gaunt face a mask of intense focus as he cross-referenced her findings with his own. Late one evening, with a cold rain tapping a frantic rhythm against the single grimy window, Samuel laid it all out on the rough-hewn table between them. The documents formed a damning mosaic. Next to the ship's manifest for the Sea Nymph, which listed a cargo of agricultural tools and textiles, was a separate, smuggled bill of lading, its paper cheap and coarse, detailing the human misery hidden below decks. Samuel had procured a private ledger, stolen at great risk from the counting house of J. Croft, one of the creditors named in Silas's own hidden book. The entries were a chilling parallel universe to the one Eleanor had discovered. Where her father's ledger showed debts cleared by the Harrington Union and Beaumont Alliance, Croft's ledger showed massive, regular payments from Harrington and Beaumont being funneled through a series of shell companies and false fronts before being recorded as clean, legitimate dowries and investments in the Montgomery estate. The money, Samuel explained in a low, steady voice, was blood money, profits from the sale of human beings. The marriages were the final, respectable rinse in a complex laundering cycle. By marrying into the Montgomery name, men like Harrington and Beaumont weren't just gaining a wife. They were purchasing a pedigree, a shield of Southern aristocracy to hide behind. Their illicit fortunes would be washed clean by the Union, transformed into respectable plantation wealth, their criminal origins buried under layers of marital law and social convention. The Montgomery daughters were not just brides. They were the most valuable assets in a vast, cynical scheme to sanitize the profits of the slave trade. Eleanor listened, her hands clenched in her lap, the horror of it settling over her like a shroud. It was one thing to suspect her father of greed and desperation, but this was a complicity so profound it felt like a physical blow. He was not just a debtor. He was a willing accomplice, the gatekeeper of a respected name being sold to the highest, most vile bidder. She thought of Charlotte, her quiet dignity being used as a cloak for this evil, and of Amelia, her tender heart being offered up to a man who saw human lives as columns in a ledger. The romantic fairy tale was a lie, and the gilded cage was built with bars of human suffering. Together, they began to document everything. Samuel's precise, scholarly hand filled page after page of a new, secret ledger of their own. They copied names, dates, and transaction amounts, creating a clear, undeniable trail from the holds of the slave ships to the marriage contracts being prepared in her father's study. Eleanor provided the context from inside the house, the timing of the suitors' visits, the specific amounts of debt mentioned in her father's ledger, the chilling casualness with which he had threatened her. She described the wedding preparations, the forced gaiety that was nothing more than a performance for the community, a final act in the play of respectability. They worked through the night, the single candle burning low, their shared purpose of fire that kept the encroaching darkness at bay. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the window, they had assembled a case that could destroy her father, ruin the suitors, and shatter the carefully constructed lies that held their world together. The revelation was complete, and it was more terrible than she had ever imagined. The truth was no longer a shadow. It was a weapon, sharpened and ready, and they were prepared to wield it. The weight of the documented truth was a physical burden in Eleanor's hands. The sheaf of papers Samuel had helped her compile feeling heavier than stone. The ink on the pages was not just pigment. It was the crystallized evidence of her father's damnation and the suitor's villainy. The gilded lies that upheld Montgomery Hall were about to be shattered, and she was the one who would wield the hammer. She found her sisters in the morning room, a scene of heartbreaking normalcy. Charlotte was listlessly embroidering, her needle moving with a mechanical rhythm that spoke of a soul elsewhere. Amelia was by the window, bathed in a shaft of sunlight, a dreamy smile playing on her lips as she no doubt imagined Julian Beaumont's face. Eleanor closed the door, the soft click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Both sisters looked up, their expressions shifting from placid distraction to wary curiosity at the grim finality on her face. She did not sit. She stood before them, the documents held tight against her chest, and began to speak. Her voice was low, devoid of the frantic energy of their previous arguments, filled instead with a terrible, unshakable calm. She started not with accusations, but with facts, laying out the architecture of their father's ruin with the cold precision of an accountant reading a balance sheet. She spoke of the debts, the true, staggering sums that went far beyond bad investments, debts owed to men whose names were synonymous with shadow and corruption. Then, she turned the page both literally and figuratively. She described the ledger's coded entries, the direct links between the marriages and the settlement of those specific tainted debts. She watched as Charlotte's face, already pale, lost all remaining color, her embroidery falling forgotten to her lap. But it was when she turned to the evidence against the suitors themselves that the true earthquake began. She laid out the proof of Harrington's brutal business practices, the whispers of his first wife's fate, painting him not as a stern businessman but as a predator. Charlotte let out a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. The duty she had clung to so fiercely was not a noble sacrifice. It was a leash, and she had willingly fastened it around her own neck. The horror on her face was a profound, gut-wrenching regret, the shattering of a lifetime of belief in her father and her own sense of honor. Then Eleanor turned to Amelia. Her voice softened, not to spare her, but because the truth for Amelia was a different kind of knife. She spoke of Julian Beaumont, not the charming suitor, but the cold-eyed partner in the dockside warehouse. She described the slavers, the map, the ship, the sea nymph, and the ledger that connected his romantic gifts directly to the profits of human misery. She held out the damning pages, the copied manifests and coded letters, a tangible nightmare made of paper and ink. Amelia's reaction was not one of immediate horror, but of violent, desperate denial. She shook her head, her dreamy smile replaced by a stubborn, frightened scowl. She called it lies, hysterical fabrications spun by a jealous sister who wanted to destroy her happiness. She accused Eleanor of trying to steal her future, of twisting innocent business dealings into something monstrous. Her voice rose, shrill and panicked, as she defended the man she loved, clinging to the beautiful fiction he had crafted for her with the tenacity of someone drowning. But as Eleanor continued, her voice relentless and her evidence irrefutable, the fortress of Amelia's denial began to crumble. The color drained from her cheeks, and her protests turned into ragged, disbelieving sobs. The fairy tale was not just ending. It was being revealed as a gothic horror, and the prince was the monster. In the suffocating silence that followed, the three sisters stood amidst the ruins of their former lives. Charlotte was weeping silent tears of shame and regret, her compliance now feeling like a betrayal of her very soul. Amelia was shattered, her worldview in pieces around her. And Eleanor, standing between them, felt the fierce, protective love that had driven her this far solidify into an unbreakable bond of shared purpose. They were no longer the obedient daughter, the romantic dreamer, and the rebellious skeptic. They were three women, united by a devastating truth and a single burning resolve. They looked at one another, their eyes meeting in a silent, solemn pact. The weddings would not happen. They would stand together and they would fight. The first copy of the Northern newspaper arrived in town like a lit fuse, its journey from the printing press a quiet, deliberate act of sabotage that would detonate with the force of a cannonade. It was Samuel's work, a masterpiece of incendiary journalism that laid bare the entire sordid tapestry of the Montgomery scheme. The article did not merely whisper of scandal. It shouted it from the front page, its bold, black typeface a declaration of war against the genteel facade of Southern propriety. It named names, Silas Montgomery, Alastair Harrington, Julian Beaumont, and laid out the evidence with the cold, irrefutable logic of a prosecutor's brief. It connected the plantation's debts to the slavers' ledgers, the marriage contracts to the blood money, weaving a narrative of corruption so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room of anyone who read it. The scandal did not break. It erupted. The newspaper was passed from hand to trembling hand in the general store, its pages smudged with the shock of its readers. The quiet hum of gossip that had permeated the town for weeks exploded into a roar of outrage and condemnation. On porches and in parlors, respectable citizens who had once bowed to the Montgomery name now spoke it with a hiss of disgust. The carefully maintained illusion of honor was shattered, revealing the rotten core of financial desperation and moral bankruptcy. The news traveled faster than any rider, carried on a current of collective fury, reaching every corner of the county by midday. The Montgomery name, once a symbol of legacy, was now a byword for treachery and greed. The reaction from the authorities was swift and merciless. The article was more than gossip. It was a documented accusation that demanded a response. By noon, a grim-faced magistrate and 2 federal marshals, their presence a stark reminder of the law's long reach, rode through the wrought iron gates of Montgomery Hall. They did not come with polite inquiries, but with the grim purpose of men tasked with dismantling a criminal enterprise. The sight of their official carriage on the grand driveway sent a visible tremor through the household, the servants scattering like startled birds, their loyalties finally and completely severed by the weight of public shame. Inside the house, Silas Montgomery's world crumbled in real time. The newspaper lay open on his desk, its damning words seeming to bleed into the polished wood. The color had drained from his face, leaving a gray, haggard mask where the proud patriarch had once presided. When the sharp, official knock came at his study door, he flinched as if struck. He had spent a lifetime building a reputation, polishing the family name until it shone, and in the space of a single morning, it had been reduced to ashes. He could hear the outraged voices from the town, a distant but growing roar that felt like a physical assault on the walls of his home. His hands, usually so steady, trembled uncontrollably, rattling the crystal decanter as he tried to pour himself a drink he would not taste. The panic was a wild animal trapped in his chest, clawing at his ribs. He was a man caught in the glare of a truth he could no longer control, his every calculation, every desperate scheme, laid bare for the world to see and judge. The empire of lies he had built to save himself was collapsing, and he was buried at the center, watching his reputation, his power, and his future turn to dust around him. The arrest of Silas Montgomery was not a quiet affair, conducted in the shadows of his study, but a public spectacle that served as the final, brutal punctuation to the scandal. The federal marshals led him from the grand entrance of Montgomery Hall, his hands bound, his head bowed not in shame but in a kind of stunned disbelief. The bright, unforgiving sunlight seemed to mock the darkness he had cultivated, illuminating every line of defeat on his face as he was paraded down the driveway. A crowd had gathered beyond the gates, their faces a mosaic of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. They did not cheer. They watched in a heavy, judgmental silence as the man who had once been their social superior was loaded into a carriage and taken away to face the consequences of his crimes. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now a curse whispered on the wind. His legacy not one of honor, but of handcuffs and disgrace. In the wake of the cataclysm, a hollow, echoing silence descended upon Montgomery Hall. The frantic energy of the wedding preparations was gone, replaced by the ghostly stillness of an interrupted ritual. The garlands of flowers, now wilting and brown, hung like funeral wreaths. The ivory silk drapes, meant for a celebration, now looked like shrouds. The daughters, freed from the legal binds of the marriage contracts by the very scandal that had ruined them, were left to navigate the wreckage of their family's name. The freedom was a bitter, empty victory, tasting of ash and regret. Charlotte moved through the cavernous rooms like a phantom, her gaze forever turned inward. The weight of her dutiful compliance had transformed into a crushing guilt. She saw the hollow eyes of the portraits lining the walls not as ancestors, but as accusers. Every piece of silver, every thread of the Persian carpets, seemed tainted by the knowledge of what they had nearly cost. Her obedience, once her guiding star, now felt like a profound and shameful blindness. She had been the willing instrument of her own imprisonment, and the knowledge was a constant, aching wound. Amelia's world had been shattered into 1,000 glittering, painful pieces. The charming fairy tale had been revealed as a gothic horror, and the prince was a monster whose touch now felt like a brand upon her memory. She spent her days curled in a window seat, staring out at the grounds with unseeing eyes. The sonnets Mr. Beaumont had read to her now sounded like lies set to meter, the delicate watercolor of the bluebird a mocking reminder of a freedom she had never possessed. Her innocence was not just lost. It had been violently stolen, and in its place was a cold, bewildered grief for a love that had never existed. Eleanor watched her sisters, her own heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She had won. She had uncovered the truth, stopped the weddings, and brought her father to justice. But the cost was a landscape of utter desolation. The bonds of sisterhood, though reforged in the crucible of the confrontation, were still fragile, scarred by betrayal and misunderstanding. The home of her childhood was now a monument to corruption and failure. As she walked through the quiet house, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, she reflected on the terrible price of truth. It had been a necessary fire, purging the rot, but it had also consumed everything in its path: their security, their standing, their trust in their father, and the simple, uncomplicated love they had once shared. They were free, but they were free in a world that had been stripped bare, 3 sisters standing together in the ruins, bound by a shared tragedy and the daunting, uncertain task of building a new life from the ashes of the old.